Hello, my wonderful people. Today, we begin learning about a biopsychology and the foundations of neuroscience. So, knowing about the brain, its disorders, and treatments is critical to psychologists because our brains really underlie every single thought and emotion and behavior that we think and feel and do as human beings. So, what do we know about the brain? A couple fun little facts to get us started today. It's about the size of a grapefruit. It weighs about 3 pounds. It's pinkish gray, full of wrinkles, and looks really simple, but it's actually the most complex structure known to man. The brain houses and directs 100 billion nerve cells that communicate with 10,000 other nerve cells to regulate your bodily functions, generate your thoughts, emotions, desires, and control your behavior every single day. As we're going to learn in this unit, the brain and nervous system really work together in incredible ways to direct our lives. And psychologists are specifically interested in how our brain produces thoughts, emotions, and behaviors specifically. So, to get there, we need to start with the basics. And so, today, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the building blocks of the nervous system, the endocrine system, and eventually we'll build our way up to understanding the brain itself. Specifically today, we are going to focus on neurons and neural communication. So, if you're already thinking to yourself, I don't know if this is going to be very exciting, why should I care about this? Want you to suspend your judgment for a minute, and I want you to think about a time in your life that you had a really intense physical or emotional or both reaction to something in your environment. Maybe you were terrified by something. Maybe you were overjoyed, or you felt a really strong physical or emotional reaction to a person, a movie, an object. You get the idea. So I want you to think about the last time that you had this really intense physiological reaction. And I want you to try to remember what was happening in your mind. What were you thinking? And then what were you feeling, not only emotionally, but physiologically? Try to see if you can bring yourself back to that point in time and think about what did it physically feel like for you to be in that particular state. And I'm going to ask you guys to share some of these stories when I get to see you in class next time. And I'll tell you about a really embarrassing moment that I had when I had a really intense emotional reaction to something. And the reason I'm asking you to think about that is because all of those reactions that you had were directed by your brain via neurons in your body working together as part of your nervous system and with your endocrine system. Okay, so our job today is that we're going to first take a look at the structures of a neuron and their functions. So we want to look at one particular neuron and we want to understand what are the key structures of this neuron and how do they function. Then we're going to look at how one neuron sends a message to another neuron in a neuron chain so that we can eventually build our knowledge up to understanding the nervous system, the endocrine system, and how the brain works to control both of those systems in creating your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. All right, so let's dive right into the fun here. My face is blocking the word descriptions here, but that's okay. All right. So, taking a look at the structure of a neuron, let's start out by looking at the dendrites. Okay, so if you're looking at the diagram, the dendrites are those purple branches that are extending out of the cell body. And the function of the dendrites of a neuron is basically to just receive information from other neurons. At any given time, neurons are receiving all kinds of excitatory and inhibitory messages from neighboring neurons, and the dendrites are simply receiving those messages and sending them to the cell body for further processing. Okay, so you want to think of the dendrites as the receivers of information. We also have the soma or the cell body, the nucleus resides there, and that's really the control center of the neuron. And so the cell body at any given point in time is simply summarizing and organizing all of these messages that are coming into the body from the dendrites and then directing the cell. What is the cell going to do based on this incoming information? So our dendrites are the receivers. The cell body is basically just the boss of the cell. It's going to tell the cell what to do via the nucleus there. We also have an axon, and the axon is a long fiber that extends from the cell body and ends in terminal buttons, okay? It's basically a road down which messages travel within a particular neuron. So we'll learn more about that in a moment. And then we also have the myelin sheath. And so the myelin sheath is basically a fatty covering that surrounds the axon. And the myelin sheath, it speeds up how quickly a message can be sent within a particular neuron. The fattier the myelin sheath, the more quickly, the more efficient the neuron is going to send a message. Okay. And then finally, we have terminal buttons, which contain chemicals called neurotransmitters. So those are the structures of a neuron and their basic functions. Now let's look at how a neuron communicates within itself and then with other neurons to direct our bodies. So if you can imagine at the inside of your body, there are so many neurons lined up side by side by side by side by side. And I like to think of your neurons communicating with each other as tons of people playing a game of telephone. Basically, in general, each neuron is sending excitatory or inhibitory messages to its neighbor via neurotransmitters. And if the message is excitatory, it's going to cause the neighboring neuron to fire. If it's not, it's going to cause the neighboring neuron to remain at rest. So let's look into that in a little bit more detail. I'm going to just kind of describe to you using some key vocabulary the way that one neuron sends a message to another neuron. And what I would love for you to do is really just focus your attention on your interactive notebook and make sure that for each vocabulary term that I share with you, you're getting a good idea what is the definition of that, and then how do each of these terms relate together when we're thinking about neurocommunication, okay? So when a neuron is at rest, it's just at its resting state. It's not doing anything in particular. It's just kind of sitting around receiving incoming messages. We say that a neuron's resting potential is negatively charged, okay? So any neuron at rest in your body is negatively charged in its resting potential. And we just talked about the idea that a neuron in its resting state via its dendrites is receiving all types of excitatory and inhibitory messages from neighboring neurons, and bringing those into the cell body, into the soma for processing. Now, each neuron has a threshold or a level of excitation needed for that neuron to fire a message. And when the neuron reaches its threshold, specifically, this means when the number of excitatory messages coming into a neuron outweigh inhibitory messages, then something called depolarization occurs. Depolarization is basically a change in the electrical charge of the neuron. And it happens because these gates or ion channels of the axon membrane pop open and allow positively charged ions to rush into the axon, thereby changing the electrical charge of the neuron. We said that a neuron at rest is in a negative state. But when depolarization occurs, the electrical charge is temporarily changed to positive in a way in which this action potential, this electrical wave, shoots all the way down the axon into the terminal buttons of a neuron. Okay, so let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So this action potential, this change in electrical charge from negative to positive, it always begins near the soma, and then it shoots down the axon toward the terminal buttons. Okay, so one more time, depolarization initiates this electrical charge, this action potential that always travels one way from the soma to the terminal buttons in a neuron. Okay, something to know about the action potential is that it's all or nothing. It's either going to fire all the way down to the terminal buttons, or it's not going to fire at all. There's no halfway. Okay, again, the myelin sheath, if we have a nice fatty myelin sheath around the axon, then that's going to speed up the message. So we kind of want to think of the axon again as this road down which this action potential, this electrical message travels. And the fattier the surrounding of the road, the quicker the message is going to reach the terminal buttons. Okay. I also have this listed for you in your interactive notebook in case you want to just see a visual story of how a neuron sends a message to another neuron. So just wanted to point that out for you. Okay, once an action potential reaches the terminal buttons, the axon terminals, those release chemicals called neurotransmitters into the synapse. Now, the synapse is just the space that exists between two neighboring neurons. So the synapse includes the dendrites of the receiving neuron, the terminal buttons of the sending neuron, and the little bit of space that exists between those two neurons. That's what we mean when we talk about a synapse. And you can see that there in the diagram. Okay. Once terminal buttons shoot chemical neurotransmitters across the synapse, those neurotransmitters are going to bind to receptor sites on the neighboring neuron, on the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, and then the process of neural transmission continues. But some of those neurotransmitters are not going to be used. They're not going to bind to the receptor sites of neighboring neurons, and instead, they're going to go through a process called reuptake. So after neurotransmitters stimulate the receptors on the receiving neuron, on their dendrites, then some of those chemicals are taken back up into the sending neuron to be used again later. So you just want to remember that vocabulary term reuptake, it means that once neurotransmitters have been released, those that do not bind onto the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, they just get recycled. They get taken back up into the terminal buttons again for use in the future. One other vocabulary term related to neural firing is after a neuron has actually fired and chemical neurotransmitters have been shot across the synapse onto the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, there's a refractory period, which is basically just a rest period in which it's not physiologically possible for the neuron to fire again until it pumps positively charged ions back outside of it, or it becomes repolarized. So the refractory period just refers to this resetting period where the neuron has to go back into its negative resting state before it could possibly be depolarized and send another message. Okay, so that is neural transmission in a nutshell. One key thing to remember about neural transmission, and you can write this in your notebook somewhere, is that neural transmission, we refer to it as an electrochemical process. Okay, so within one neuron, there's an electrical message that travels from the soma to the terminal buttons. It's that action potential. Once those terminal buttons are stimulated, though, by that electrical charge, they release chemical neurotransmitters between neurons. So from one neuron to another that travel across the synapse and bind to the receptor sites of those receiving dendrites, then that's a chemical message. So we call it an electrochemical message. Within a neuron, the message is electrical. Between neurons, the message is chemical. Okay, if you want to dive a little bit deeper, if you're really into science and you want to better understand the chemicals happening within, excuse me, you guys, long day, happening within that action potential, if you want to actually see a visual of that happening, feel free to check out this video. If you don't, no problem, but I just wanted to let you know that this is here for you. It's about a 5-minute recap inside the slides for this particular section. Okay, last thing we're going to do in this introductory portion here is we just talked about neurotransmitters. We talked about how those are chemicals that get shot across the synapse and bind to the receptor sites of neighboring neurons. Want to tell you about some specific neurotransmitters that psychologists are interested in particular. And for these neurotransmitters that we're going to look at together, you want to have a good understanding of what does this neurotransmitter control for in the body, and what psychological issues happen when that neurotransmitter is malfunctioning. And this is specifically what biopsychologists are interested in, neuropsychologists are interested in. Okay, so the first one that we're going to look at, and you can complete these in your chart for this week. There's a chart in your interactive notebook. Looking at acetylcholine. So, in typical doses in the body, acetylcholine helps with your muscle action, learning, and memory. Okay. An example of a malfunction related to acetylcholine would be with Alzheimer's disease. That's due to a lack of acetylcholine in your body. Another really important neurotransmitter is dopamine. So, in typical amounts in your body, dopamine influences your movement, your ability to learn and pay attention and express emotion. Dopamine is linked to some really interesting psychological disorders. So, too much dopamine receptor activity is actually linked to the disease schizophrenia. And not enough dopamine is actually linked to the tremors and limited mobility that comes with Parkinson's disease. And interestingly, if you give Parkinson's patients more dopamine to try to accommodate for that, they end up developing hallucinations and other symptoms associated with schizophrenia. So, very interesting the powerful effect that some neurotransmitters have in our bodies. Another really important neurotransmitter is serotonin. Serotonin specifically affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. So, a lot of those basic physiological needs that we have to get met in order to function as human beings. We know that an undersupply of serotonin is linked to depression. And if you know anybody who's taking any medication for depression, a lot of times those are called SSRIs. That stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And it basically acts on neural communication at the synapse, and it floods the dendrites of receiving neurons with serotonin. It blocks the serotonin from going through that reuptake process. And so it's just sending messages over and over and over again to the receiving dendrites. We also have norepinephrine. This helps control alertness and arousal overall. Again, if we don't have enough of that, it can depress our mood. GABA is another neurotransmitter, and this is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. So, an undersupply of GABA is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. It basically results in an overactive, overly stimulated nervous system. And finally, glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's involved in memory. An oversupply can overstimulate the brain, producing migraines or seizures. And that's why some people avoid MSG in food. It's just kind of fun fact for you there. And then lastly, we didn't have space for this in your chart in the interactive notebook, but I did want to draw your attention to endorphins. So endorphins are so happy and amazing, my friends. Endorphins, the function of endorphins in your body, those neurotransmitters, they help relieve pain. And in the absence of pain, they actually result in amazingly elevated mood, reduction in stress, and just an overall sense that you're doing okay. Endorphins in particular are created in your pituitary gland and hypothalamus. Obviously, both of those are located in your brain. And endorphins, even in psychologically well people, can do so much to just aid your quality of life. So, highly recommend exercising on a regular basis, whatever that looks like for you. When you do that, it helps with symptoms of depression, it decreases stress and anxiety, it aids in weight loss, and it even just boosts your self-esteem and overall feelings of self-worth. Okay, some malfunctions related to not enough endorphins include different body aches and pains, even addiction to things like Tylenol or other things like that, and multiple sleep issues. So I'll give you some really interesting examples of those types of things when I see you in class next time. Okay, just one more note. I've been talking about how neurotransmitters are released from terminal buttons and they bind to the receptor sites on neighboring neurons. Just want to give you a visual of what that looks like. So that receiving cell membrane, that's part of a dendrite of a receiving neuron. you can see that the receptor site there, it's almost like a little lock and key. And whatever neurotransmitter is hanging out in the synapse there, it fits into that receptor site, again, kind of like a lock and key, a perfect fit, if you will. We're going to talk about drug use and abuse as part of this upcoming chapter. And so I just want to introduce these terms here as the final little part of this section. And we'll pick this back up when we look more specifically at the effect of drugs on your brain, because drugs either mimic or block naturally occurring neurotransmitters in your brain. And that kind of relates to the high that people feel. So an agonist is some sort of molecule that fills the receptor site on a receiving dendrite and activates it. And so it mimics or acts like a particular neurotransmitter. Some psychotropic drugs act in those ways. And I'll give you an example in a sec. An antagonist molecule actually fills the lock, but doesn't do anything. All it does is prevent a real neurotransmitter from getting in there and activating the receptor site. So we do want to know the difference between agonists and antagonists. And just to give you some tangible examples here, the drug Xanax, if you know anyone who takes Xanax as an anti-anxiety remedy, this drug acts as an agonist. It mimics GABA and it excites the cell, which actually causes you to calm down. Okay, just gave you an example of SSRIs. And then an example of an antagonist, so individuals with schizophrenia that have too much dopamine, they take antipsychotic medications that act as dopamine antagonists. So they block receptor sites from receiving more dopamine from the synapse so that they can't continue to be overly aroused in that particular way. All right, and then just wanted to leave you with kind of a visual of what this can look like. And so you can see here up at the top of the screen, here's our sending neuron. So the action potential is traveling all the way down that neuron to the terminal buttons, where then those chemical neurotransmitters are released across the synapse. Some of them are now binding into the receptor sites that you can see on the receiving neuron. The ones that don't then are going to go through that process of reuptake. All right, so thanks for hanging in there with me as we talked about neural structure, function, and communication in this particular section. Next up, we're going to look more broadly at the nervous system and the endocrine system and how those can kind of work together at a broader level to send messages throughout your brain and body that influence our thoughts, emotions, and behavior.